We got 50 minutes. Got
Cool.
it.
I've got
Ladies,
however long you've got.
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to YouTube live edition of the Wisdom Workshop with my conversation sparring partner, not less of a spar and more of a dialectical dance, shall we say. Jimmy McCulloch is an engineer, previous student who has been reading up on self-actualization, as I have been. Psychology of self-actualization and self-directed learning has been my recent areas of study, is how education connects with self-actualization and how self-directed learning connects to our ability to self-actualize. Interestingly, self-actualization can mean different things in different psychological models. That's why in the title we put the Paradox of Self-Actualization, because there may be some aspect of self-transcendence in self-actualization. I wanted to talk with you again because you are a wonderful interlocutor, question asker, and in our last conversation, we started to geek out on the idea of self-mastery, becoming the best version of ourselves,
Yeah.
and how that requires a workshop. And
Yes.
so I know you wanted to start there, and I want to start there as well. I'm curious about how if I just said without any previous context that we need to workshop ourselves,
hmm
what does that bring up for you? Does that seem like that makes sense?
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind is agency, right?
Oh,
So,
excellent.
yeah. So agency is kind of,
Excellent.
to me, it's kind of the key of moving forward as a person, and that means kind of moving through the stages of life requires an increase in agency
Excellent.
and an increase in mastery, and those two are, to me,
Awesome.
completely intertwined, right? So let's just take, from a baby, right? A baby doesn't know anything, has no agency, has no mastery of anything except screaming and pooping, right? So, so as you progress through your life, as a toddler, as a young child, as a teen, young adult, and then kind of where I am, where I just, I'm in my early 30s, and now I'm kind of getting my life in order the way that I think that I want my future to be, right? But it took 30 years to get there, right? 30 years. And so agency to me is kind of, that's where you actually start being able to decide what you want to do and how you are going to achieve it, right? And
Mm.
so we've talked about it, I think, in like every one of our conversations about the free will versus determinism, and we're going to skip that because for me, agency is the manifestation of what we think of as free will, right? I'm able to decide and I want to do something and I need to do these steps, right? And so philosophically, we're going to have to just shelve that whole conversation, unfortunately or fortunately. But the agency piece, so everybody has their different interests and things that they find important just kind of naturally, right? So you and I, when we were 6 years old, we both had some similar interests, but we also had very different interests, right? And that's the individual's part, right? That's what makes you you and me, right? There's a lot of overlap, of course, in interests and everything like that, but there's an agency that comes inherent with humanity, but that has to be fostered, right? You don't, if you're just in this locked down, sort of rigid ideological household or society or school, whatever it is, if it's too rigid, then you don't have the agency, right? And so for me as a little boy, I was a little maniac because they wouldn't let me make any decisions. And it's not
Awesome.
it's not that I thought as, like, let's say 6 years old, that I would make good decisions, or that my parents were wrong or my teachers were wrong in not letting me make certain decisions. But not letting somebody make any decisions kind of completely erodes their sense of agency that they're supposed to be building as a person. So
I just want to interject. We mean
yeah,
meaningful agency,
yes,
right? Like, so
yes,
me choosing whether or not I wear the black socks or the brown socks is not the type of agency we're talking about. We're
no,
talking about whether or not we go to college or not, which
yes,
interestingly, I just in yesterday's lecture asked my students after we read the Mark Edmondson piece, Who Are You? What Are You Doing Here? How
yeah,
many of them actually felt like they made the decision to come
yeah,
to college,
yes,
or if it was just kind of a given that they'd be there. It's
yeah,
interesting that, only about maybe, again, 1/3 to 1/4 of students confidently raised their hands when I said,
yeah,
how many of you felt like you made the decision to come to
hmm,
university? One
hmm,
fourth. How many of you
hmm,
felt like it was just what society it
hmm,
was just a given? That's just what you do.
hmm,
Now, this is more tentative, but the rest of
hmm,
the class tentatively raise their hands, and a very critical student says, I don't know that that's really an either or.
yeah,
And to the point, so just back to your point, we're
yeah,
talking about big decisions, life
yes,
decisions, decisions that
yes,
make me one kind of a person or the other, do
yes,
one kind of a thing or the other. So
yes,
we don't, and I'm going to agree with you that we don't have the opportunity to be
hmm,
supported in making those meaningful decisions.
yes. And so
Cool.
that's kind of the thesis of a lot of Jonathan Haidt's work,
Hmm.
and just sort of that idea of the coddling of the American mind
Right.
is it's it's setting our younger generations up for failure because you've been told what to do from the moment you were born until you're 18 years old. You graduate high school and they're like, cool, you're going to go to college. We're gonna tell you to go to college, right? So you don't have a choice in that. Like
Because
what?
we care for you, let's
Yeah, we
remember
care
that
for
this
your.
is.
This is correct. This is
Yep.
true. And
Yep.
so there's a piece of this that I want to talk about with the parent side as well. But we've told you what to do for your whole life. Now I'm telling you to go to college, but I'm not telling you what to study. I'm telling you a couple of
Yeah.
these. I'm telling you a
Mm.
couple of these things not to study. Don't
Mm.
go here. Don't go here. This one's not going to make you any money. This one's much more prestigious. But you don't tell them why. You don't
Mm.
ask them what they would like. There's no agency there. But now they're 18. Their brains aren't still fully functioning and fully formed, but they're technically adults.
Yep.
So the decisions that they're making at that point are based on piss poor decision making skills because they've never made any
No
big
practice.
decisions. They don't
Right.
have, you have to practice every single skill.
Which leads us back to the workshop.
Yes, yes. But before we get to the workshop, we have to get to just a quick word on the parents. And so the parents, it's you see these cycles in history just over the past 100 years, right?
Yeah.
Of parenting styles, right? Post World War One was very different pre World War II, right? So each 10-year gap kind of changes the philosophy because of the overbearing nature or the underperforming nature of the parents on the children. And so then the children start becoming young adults and they're like, well, that was all nonsense, whatever they were
Yeah.
doing. Like, and so you just have these cycles of parenting, right? But since about the 90s, I've seen, instead of a cycle, I've just seen it ramping up in terms of reducing children's abilities to make bigger decisions because of the complexity of the world, right? These parents are like, well, you need to learn these skills because the world is going to leave you behind if you don't learn them, right? And so it's the parents are always in a pickle because now we have the age of technology, right? So we're getting so much information and parents are just, they're on Google getting bombarded with, oh, if your kid does this, he's going to get cancer. If your kid does this, she's going to get kidnapped, right? There's so much going on and parents are in this really tricky position where it's like, how much agency do I give my kid? How much risk am I willing to put my child into in order to mature as a person, but also not be hit with traumatic experiences that can completely stump the growth, right? So there's a balance in there. Just like with everything in life, you need to figure out your risk to reward balance, right? And I think that right now, our risk aversion as a society for really across the board for parenting, for COVID, for so many different things, I think our risk aversion is a little too skewed and we're missing out on a lot of the benefits of taking those risks. We are very safe, but that's not what life is, right? Life is about making those big decisions and moving forward as a person. I don't know. What do you think about all that?
I think, I mean, I want to avoid the generalizations,
That's
for
fair.
one. For two, I think the interesting thing here is that this is like a personal decision almost,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is difficult to. The parenting angle is really fascinating when we
Mm-hmm.
start talking about agency,
Yep.
because
Yep.
as your father, I'm going to make some decisions for you
Yep.
until you can make them for yourself.
Yep. Yep.
And then, so where does that leave me as your son?
Yes.
Like you said, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
freaking go crazy and like I will find a way to be free.
Yes.
Um, because that is, ironically and interestingly, a foundation of moral philosophy in the West is our ability to choose. Without the,
Yes.
without the ability to choose, our agency.
Yes.
So I want to double click on what you said originally, being able to decide what you want to do.
Yes.
That um, decision making ability.
Mm-hmm.
So we're
Mm-hmm.
talking skill, we're talking practice,
Yes.
and this is standing out to me because I just was working with a student that shared that they're chronically indecisive. They just have
Mm-hmm.
a hardest time making decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and I think decision making skills obviously high level. I don't know that we never. I know I got two master's degrees and never learned. I mean, ideally, we should have like 4 or 5 different mental models to make decisions and be able to apply them in different situations. And
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So I
Well,
kind of want to focus in on this ability to decide and what that means. How does that
mhm.
connect?
Well, and that leads right into the workshop piece, right? Because um, your ability to make decisions is based on your previous ability to make decisions, right? So each decision builds on another, right? Even if they seem totally disparate, like they are connected because of the way that you decide to make these decisions, and the outcomes often blend together, right? So as a kid, you're always testing your parents' boundaries. And if you figure out that those boundaries are just like they're rock solid and there's nothing past it, and you're never able to make any of those decisions, then you never get to figure out what to work with, right? You're only working with what somebody else told you, and that's a very, very narrow lane, right? And so the point of a workshop to me is you go in there and it's full of tools and it's full of workbenches and it's full of unfinished projects, right? And all of those ideas and decisions that you make are unfinished projects, right? So if I walk into my garage right now, right, I've got several different projects going, right? But each one is at different stages, and why I walked away from them was a different decision. Why I did this thing to this piece was a different decision. And every time that you make a decision, you're working on your decision making abilities. And that's not like, oh, now I know how to make decisions. It's like, no, you have to make a bunch of decisions in a bunch of different areas to figure out, like you were talking about, mental models for different things, right? I can't think about writing an article the same way as I can think about going into a jujitsu match, right? They're two totally different things, but because I've made decisions in a lot of different areas of my life, I'm now better able to make decisions in all areas of my life, right? And the workshop to me is is a place to create, to fix, and to learn, right? And I, the idea of the workshop to me kind of comes from um, apprenticeships, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of apprentice was you're taking a young child. Um, hopefully they showed some interest in the skill they're about to learn from this master, right? Ideally, the young child is really interested in something, and then they're paired up with with a master carpenter or whatever it is, right? And they're now taken under the wing of that master, and they start working in the shop on those skills to become a master themselves, right? But they still need to learn all of those things. But the master doesn't just tell the apprentice what to do every step of the way, right? They start off teaching you the skills, just the basic skills, right? Like we talked about last time, I need to know letters before I can know words. I need to know words before letters, and then paragraphs, pages, books, series, right? Once you learn those basic skills, then the master has to start teaching you or letting you make some decisions. Like if you're a blacksmith, they're like, okay, well, you now know you've worked on hundreds of hammers with me. Go make a hammer. And he doesn't tell them if it's broken, if it doesn't work, you're out, right? He's like, just go figure it out, right? And doing something on your own for the first time, even if you've spent hundreds of hours doing it with the guidance of somebody else, is totally different. It's totally different. You take out one little piece of instruction, it changes the whole dynamic of your thought process, right? So now you're building this hammer and you're like, dude, I've never actually built a hammer myself. I always just like, he told me to hit here, so I hit here. He told me to put the wood in here, so I put the wood in here. I clamped here. Now I'm like, oh dang, I don't know how to do any of this on my own, but you do, right? Now you have to apply all of it, and that's the point of the workshop, and that's the difference to me between a lot of academia and applied learning, right? We're not just talking about philosophy. Philosophy is not supposed to just be talked about. Socrates and Plato weren't sitting around talking about this stuff just to talk about it. They were trying to create a culture that was working on itself based on these ideas that were whittled down out of the ether, right? So the whole point of the workshop is applied knowledge, right? And to do anything kind of worthwhile to me in terms of creative endeavors, it takes a workshop that allows you to create, fix, and learn. And those three things to me are kind of the key components of a workshop, if that kind of makes sense. And all that kind of comes back from agency. If you don't have the agency to go build that hammer, once he tells you go build the hammer, if not, then you're always an apprentice. You never take that next step. You never become an actualized human being who has mastery of any skill, let alone a multitude of skills, right? And so learning one skill allows you, you learn how to learn. From mastering a skill, it's now easier to master any other skill. So that's kind of like the basis of the idea of a workshop for me.
It's a couple awesome things there. The idea of learning how to learn, for one, and in the book Beginners that I'm reading now by Tom Vanderbilt, he is talking about how we can get better at learning how to learn, at incorporating new information. And so we basically can make the brain into a learning, more ready to learn, that keeps its cognitive functioning and keeps its cognitive health into old age based on our ability to be beginners and try new things. So that's interesting. I also really like the idea of taking something big and breaking it down into its parts. And then, so I had this question around the discrete parts of the decision-making process. Because, and for people who are interested in this, the Knowledge Project podcast with Shane Parrish, he asks nearly every one of his guests about how they make decisions. He's got the whole book on mental models, and that outlines a ton of different ways to even think about the decision-making process. But it does seem like if we are workshopping our ability to make better decisions, per se, and this is, one of the Greek words for wisdom, phronesis, is like your practical skill making. So there, in the Greek, there's Sophia, knowledge of reality. Then there's phronesis, the practical wisdom of making good decisions when you're presented with options. That, let's be real, sometimes when you're building the hammer for the first time, you have no idea if the joint that you're trying is going to work until you do it, hammer some stuff, and then see if it folds or doesn't, right? Like it takes a certain kind of application, trial and error. And so I know for me, when I'm thinking about parts of the decision making process, I'm also thinking about mindsets of a resilient decision making process. That's come up for me, that I've seen people be paralyzed because a couple reasons. One, you overly identify with the outcome of your decision. Very terrifying, because I don't want to choose wrong. Two, so I guess there's this sense of, another way of putting this is, I think there's a failure immunity. Like if I build something with the almost expecting it to fail, and realizing that I'm just trying to get better at the process rather than the outcome, that's one way of being a better decision maker, being more resilient in my decision making.
Yes.
But I wonder if other things, if I said, breaking down the discrete parts of a decision making process, what that might bring up.
Well, again, different decisions or different decision paths have different decision trees and different starting points, right? And so the resilience piece is important for all of life. Like the debilitating anxiety and indecisiveness that I see a lot of people having. I think it comes from what you were talking about, being too attached to the outcome, right? And so again, this comes from for me, I fail so many times every day, right? But I don't look at them as failures, right?
Yes.
If my buddy, if we're doing a jujitsu roll, right, and we're working on a specific thing, let's say we're working on the defense to an armbar. If he gets me into an armbar and I lose that match, even though that's exactly what we were just working on, I don't just like get up and be like, I suck at jujitsu. I'm never going to get good at, everybody's going to armbar me forever. Right? No, I'm like, okay, what he did is he controlled my elbow better than I got through to his hips. Right. And I didn't turn my body at the right time. Right. So I start breaking down each decision that I wasn't making a decision. I wasn't making a set of decisions when I was rolling. I was just going based on my previous knowledge, right? So you're just reacting at that point. You don't start making decisions about that stuff consciously until afterwards when you're looking at it. But that's the point where people break down. That's the point where they start beating themselves up, right? And so you kind of need selective memory and a short memory about your failures, because there's this kind of fetishization of failure in the modern culture, right? We hear about it all the time, like fail often, fail hard. The more you fail, the better you are.
Fast.
Yes. No, hold on. Like you should be making mistakes often, but that's not a failure, right? I didn't fail the armbar escape, right? I made a couple of mistakes and I'm going back and I'm fixing that, right? Failure to me is the culmination of a mistake and the psychological evaluation that I am now a failure, right? I am a failure because of what just happened. That's where failure comes in. So it's not really failure. Make a lot of mistakes is fine, but it's calculated mistakes. And if you make the same mistake twice, you better have a damn good reason why you made that same mistake twice. And if you make that mistake a third time in the exact same way from the exact same situation, then you're not learning. You're not learning at all. And so the decision-making process to me is more dynamic than just like, oh, the first time I ever opened a tape measure, right? I'm like, I don't know what the hell this thing is. If I finally learn how to open a tape measure and lock it out properly and take good measurements, great. But now let's actually go measure something. But if I'm off by an eighth of an inch 2 times in a row, I'm not measuring correctly, right? Something's wrong. I'm not accounting for this little gap that's in the front end of this, and the fact that it moves a little bit. But if I'm off by an eighth of an inch twice, that tells me that I'm doing something wrong. And so now I have to go back and reevaluate how I am doing anything it is that I'm doing. And I'm like, oh, that's about an eighth of an inch. I need to keep this extended. Now I'm going to get the proper measurement. So the decision-making process isn't X, Y, and Z, right? Do this, then that, and this will come out, right? Only very simple, boring things work like that. You have to, and this is where the wisdom aspect comes in. It's being able, you have to make a lot of decisions and do a lot of things to make a lot of connections in your mind so that the decision-making process is more like, oh, it was sleeting yesterday, right? So we've got this, why is it 22 degrees, but there's rain coming down? Well, you're sitting there and you're thinking, you're like, okay, well, when rain usually comes down, it's just kind of warmer out, so it never freezes. So the water is clearly not freezing up high, which means that there must be a pocket of warm air up high. And then it's coming through and it's colder down low. And so now we're getting the sleet. So as soon as it hits the ground, we got an ice storm, right? Well, if I hadn't understood how rain works, how snow works, how clouds work, how pockets of air work, I never would have been able to understand any of that. So to me, decision making in that sense is more like problem solving, and problem solving is about having a wide range of knowledge, right? And that's where wisdom to me is making all those little connections, right? So I don't know if I answered your decision making question how you wanted, but like to me, it's not necessarily a binary or step-by-step logical process. It's more of a dynamic interaction between your past knowledge and your future predictions, which can only be integrated if you've done a lot of different things. And that's, you have to master a lot of different things to really be able to make all those little connections, right? I don't know if that made sense.
It does. And it's interesting with the wisdom piece in terms of employing a wide range of knowledge. It's why we don't normally say that a young person can be wise.
Yes.
Just because they haven't had the experience of those multiple failures, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Which, I like the FAIL acronym as a faithful attempt in learning.
Yep.
So it's like a learning attempt.
Yes.
And reframing it that way.
Yes. But real quick about the age thing, it's basically impossible for a 2-year-old to be wise, but it's very possible for a 70-year-old to also not be wise. If they didn't make their mistakes and learn from those mistakes and integrate their knowledge, they're just a 70-year-old toddler, and I have no time for them. Just because you're old doesn't make you wise. It increases your chances and probability of becoming wise, but you have to apply it properly, and you have to learn from your past if you're going to be wise in my view. Maybe I'm being a little harsh, but like that's
no, I think that's interesting because it raises an interesting point about learning ability and our innate ability to learn. Because in the beginning book, he uses infants as paragons of learning, as exemplars on how they take something like 3 million steps before they actually figure out how to walk. Yeah. And they fall a ton. And it doesn't get to them, partially because they haven't cemented a sense of identity. It's not like they're not paralyzed from indecision. They just fall on their ass, and then their face, and then their hips, and then their ass, and their face, so on and so forth. So that's fascinating. I think, given our time and how this leads perfectly into the whole idea of self-actualization that we're both into, and why I said the paradox of self-actualization, that there's an aspect of transcending. I am not going to identify with the outcomes. I'm going to identify with the process.
Mhm.
And if I identify with the process, examine the process, there's a certain regard that I begin to transcend
Mhm.
uh, ordinary notion of a self, which then, you know, leads to some interesting places. And
Mhm.
the story that I think would be a cool one to tee this up in the workshop yesterday with the group we're in now, we have um, a woman that just did a World Series of poker.
Mm.
She was training for in poker. She
Yeah.
said, she loves the game of poker because it's such an elegant game of decision making,
Yes.
and that one of the dominant rules from learning poker that applies to life is that you don't care about how you train yourself to not care how the hand turns out
Mhm.
because it's out of your control.
Yep.
You train yourself to care about whether or not you made good decisions based on the
Mhm.
information you had at each step of the process,
Yep.
so that you're able to, if you're deep into a pot,
Mhm.
make the right decision at the end of that hand and not throw more money away, so that
Yeah.
it's a focus on the process rather than the outcome,
Yes.
which I think relates to this process of me becoming the best version of myself.
Mhm.
Actualizing myself is a certain regard disengaging or not attaching to Sean as master teacher,
Mhm.
or Sean as podcast host,
Mm.
or Sean as one who is able to host good conversations,
Yeah.
which are each identities I'm invested in.
Yeah. Well,
Is there is there a question in there? I
yeah.
don't know.
Well, so to me, the question kind of is, um, I guess the easiest one to start with is, what is self-actualization?
Hmm,
Right? Like, what, for people who haven't heard that term,
thank you.
what would you define self-actualization as, for a 19-year-old who just walked into one of your classes, who decides to read a little bit about Maslow or anything like that? What do you define self-actualization as?
Your ability to make real the best version of yourself.
Fair
And
enough.
maybe without the best version of yourself, I could say the ability to make real in the world who you really are,
Hmm. Hmm. That's I
depending
like.
if,
Yeah,
one of those two.
yeah. I like that definition. Okay. Then, before we get to it later down the road, what are you kind of defining transcendence as?
Great. I almost said the ability, but I'm going to moving beyond or above the limitations of a self
Hmm. Hmm.
to move beyond the terms or the boundaries of some discussion
Hmm.
into another set of terms or boundaries that are above or beyond. It's interesting. It's more difficult to define transcending because there's a language trap.
Yes. Well, there's a language trap, and even as I don't have the book here, but as Maslow was doing his research on the hierarchy of needs, right? Maslow's triangle that didn't
Isn't a
exist, but
triangle.
it's not a triangle.
Yes.
But anyways, if you're looking at the top of it, and you're thinking about transcendence as that pinnacle, he was like, okay, well then what the hell is it? He came up with a list of like there's like 30 different definitions of transcendence, right? Everything from like the Buddhist interpretations
Right.
to just people who exude a certain energy, right? They suck you into their energy, and they're like, wherever I'm going, you're coming with, and it's going to be a blast, right? And so,
Let's go.
yeah, and so the self-actualization piece leads into transcendence, because in order to actually self-actualize, before you get there, which is the problem that societies have and always will have to contend with, is that until you have satisfied your basic needs, your safety, your comfort, your food, water, shelter, all those basic needs, you can't even start thinking about transcending anything other than, dude, I got to get out of wherever I am right now.
See, and
There's this survival instinct that you have to satisfy before you can move on.
Mark Coddling, who gave a great TED talk on the power of visuals to influence how we think about things, critiqued the hierarchy
Yeah.
as having some undesirable outcomes.
Such
Namely, this what you just said, that it's impossible for me to work on self-actualization if
Mhm.
I am hungry and if I
Mhm.
don't have shelter,
as
which prioritizes or deprioritizes people who are food insecure and who don't have a roof over their head.
Mm.
And we could say, actually, when you are hungry, you are there is at least the possibility of me working to actualize who I really am on an empty stomach.
There is, but anybody who has been really hungry and
Right.
had no, there's a there's a
We
there's a
get a sense that
there's a feeling of desperation,
right.
and you can't move past that. Just like
Right.
just in this philosophical way, like, yeah,
Sure.
theoretically, if you're hungry, it doesn't mean you can't self-actualize. But I'm talking about like real problems. So I saw this video of this guy. He went to, I forget which African tribe it was, and he was hanging out with them for a couple of weeks. And there's this video, and he's talking to the villagers and specifically the hunters. And he's talking to these hunters, and he's like, "So what do you want out of life?" And they were like, "Oh, meat."
Hmm.
And he was like, "That's not really what I mean. Like what are you trying to work towards, or like, do you have any goals?" He's like, "Killing something to get the meat. What are you talking about?" And they went through the entire line and asked. He was asking all these people. He's like, one of them's got to have some, like, understand what I'm asking here. And they're like, "No, dude, we want meat because that is the most important thing for the survival of our tribe." And so there's a that's this kind of goes. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole, but there's kind of again a fetishization of the hunter gatherer lifestyle, but that's a rough lifestyle, right? That is a if an early snowstorm comes in and kills your whole crop, how are you making it through winter? Or I mean, it kills the whole berry patch. How are you making it through winter? You didn't store anything. That's why agriculture kind of started up. But in terms of satisfying those basic needs, you really there's it's hard for a lot of people who have never really been in the throes of hunger and destitution to fully understand the psychological impact that just seeing like edible stuff does, right? And being super super cold and not being able to, like, and knowing that 2 blocks down somebody does, right? So I don't know, I'd have to watch the video about that, but what I'm talking about isn't like, oh, I haven't eaten lunch today. It's like, where
Sure.
are we eating tomorrow, right? So
Sure. And I mean, there's a couple really interesting things about this story. Our culture, capitalist, consumer, American, hyper individualistic culture, we assume that we eat so that we can, I don't know, start a podcast
yeah,
or do some other things that are higher than just eating.
yes,
That's a cultural set of assumptions.
yes,
Whereas there is a certain regard that participating in the eating and being eaten of the cosmos is self actualization.
hmm
And that is self transcendence.
hmm
So, for a certain way, of course, it doesn't make sense. So, you have all the meat. What do you do then? I enjoy myself and wait for the next time I need to eat meat because that's what we do. Would you say that you're self actualized? Well, yeah, I don't know what else do you want? Like,
Yeah.
I am not, or put it another way, I am not sick with a disease of thinking I need more than
Yeah.
meat.
Yeah.
You poor thing.
Yeah.
I don't need to go to other distant countries and
Yeah.
research other people to understand what they think
Yeah.
when I'm so. And I'm tempted to go down that rabbit hole, and I just, and maybe to kind of zoom out a little bit, I did pull up the Wikipedia entry on Robert Keegan,
Yeah.
who's a adult developmental psychologist, and just to
Hmm.
say, we've been talking to Maslow.
Yeah.
There are other.
Oh yeah.
We are in terrain that humans have tried to figure out. This, what is self-actualization, which is a
Hmm.
term from Maslow, right? If I'm
He
maybe.
kind of like started the main research on a lot of these questions that other people were doing in parallel and also following him.
Right. And in the Western discipline of psychology, whereas we
Hmm.
could say Aristotle, that was his dominant question, was self-actualization. How do I
Yeah.
achieve flourishing? Or
Yeah.
eudaimonia is a state where I am the best I can possibly be.
Yeah.
Maslow probably say that's self-actualization.
Yep.
Same thing with Epicureans. If I remove all the sources of pain
Hmm.
and achieve the highest pleasure human beings can get,
Hmm.
probably self-actualization.
Hmm.
Buddhists saying if I master the wholesome mental states and achieve enlightenment,
Yeah.
probably self-actualization. Anyway, in the Western psychological world, we have Piaget,
Yeah.
Lawrence Kohlberg,
Hmm.
which I don't know anything about, Jane Weissman, Abraham Maslow, Eric Erikson,
Hmm.
um, all have different theories of psychological development,
Hmm.
focused on what that is. And I guess that's really what interests me, is that this is a vocabulary that I don't think we get. We aren't engaged in this question. What is a human life? And I don't want to generalize, at least from my
Yeah.
experience. What is a human life for in
Hmm.
general?
Hmm.
And then, who is Jimmy? Who is
Yeah.
Sean?
Yeah.
How is Sean going to be the best version of Sean?
Yeah.
And to bring it back to the workshop piece, how can I build some shit, pardon my language, it's going to help me repair, fix, experiment, fail in these small ways so that I feel
Hmm.
better and not fail. You know what
Hmm.
I'm saying.
Yeah. 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 So the workshop piece kind of leads to actualization because of the mastery piece, right? And it comes back to the agency, right? So you have, if you're given some agency to make a decision to learn how to play pool, right? So when I learned how to play pool when I was in high school, I saw the pool tables. I saw some guys playing. I was like, I never really played. Yeah, let's see what happens. And there was a guy playing named Red, and Red was just absolutely wrecking fools. There was nobody that could touch him. He didn't even he had no warm up stroke. He sat down. He looked at the table after the break and was like, okay. And you could see in his eyes, I know exactly what to do, where to put my cue ball right afterwards. And I was just looking at this fascinated. Like, how is he so good at all of this and dealing with all the probabilities and putting the perfect English on the ball? And I was like, I got to learn it, right? And so that was my workshop, was this smoky pool room at my dad's bar. There were some multiple times throughout the summer. I would be in there. Me and a couple of my buddies would be in there for 18 hours straight. 18 hours straight. Like, we would be in there, and they'd be open to the bar the next day. They're like, "There's no way you guys are still here." We're like, "Yeah, dude, we're figuring it out." And it's not. And so that type of just that type of mastery in that short amount of time, because I was like, I have to learn this over the summer, right? So I have to condense all this into a summer. And that mastery in that workshop with the you have the pool cues that you have to fix the tips on. You have the weights inside that you have to balance properly. Then you have to deal with the pool table. Like, table 3 has all of these little intricate differences. The glue's coming off on this side, so you can make different shots on that one exact spot. And so you start mastering that room, and you start being able to apply that to different things, because again, I'm learning how to learn. It's not about being really good at pool. It's about the fascination with the learning. And that's how, to me, that's one of my problems is that I find everything just all mind-boggling. Like this pen, what went into making this pen? Are you serious? Like, just the design of the shape, right? Why does it go into this little piece right here? And then there's, as simple as this little guy is, there's probably 7 different pieces made in at least 2 different countries. And then the ink, how did you come up with that? Like, to me, that fascination with learning can be fostered. And if it's not fostered at an early age, it's suppressed. And then you don't like to learn because your teacher was like, memorize that multiplication table. And I'm like, why? I know how to multiply. And they're like, just do it now. And I'm like, that's not fun. Why can't we do some fun stuff? Because learning is absolutely so fun if you frame it correctly. And so to bring all of your agency and your learning and your creativity together is reaching towards self-actualization, which leads to transcendence, right? And to me, transcendence isn't about like sitting on this cloud of Buddhism or Zen and looking down and being like, I am above you. Like, no. That's not what it's about. It's about understanding, like realizing your place in the cosmos and being fascinated by all of it, and by understanding how incredibly grateful I am to be a part of it, right? Like, we've got this short little window to learn and experience as much as possible before we're done, right? I'm at least a third of the way through, right? Like I got 2/3 left. That's a massive chunk is gone already, right? But if you're not looking at it in that perspective of appreciating how freaking awesome all of it is, to me, that's what transcendence is I'm now like, I understand my connection to everything. Like, I am stardust. Not only am I stardust, I'm my parents' children. And my parents, they're the children of the children of the children, all the way back to the beginning of life, right? And seeing that sort of chain in your mind, and understanding how bonkers it is that we get to experience, like, we are the universe experiencing itself. Oh no. If that thought doesn't blow your mind, like, I don't know what will. The universe woke up, right, from stardust and explosions, and it's so crazy. And to me, in terms of the human side of transcendence, it's being able to see yourself as part of the whole of humanity, right? And so, going back to Maslow, just because that's what I've been reading, Carl Rogers was good with all this. Piaget was kind of trying to combine the religious and the scientific worldviews, and create some sort of psychology out of that. But to me, it's about understanding your connection with humanity. And so what Maslow found, like, as his models, he was like, all of these people that I really look up to, or that display these traits, have all of these things in common, right? And the transcendent people to him were the people who were, they were very caring for their fellow humans, and they were trying to better the world for themselves. And then towards the end of his life, he started realizing, kind of trans species as well, sort of not just thinking about the human aspect, but also the animal aspect, and understanding that we're all actually connected, right? And so it was about, it was kind of the culmination of deep thinkers who had the humility to know that they didn't understand everything, but that they did understand that helping other people was one of the most meaningful things for them, right? So that transcendence is instead of just worrying about it's worrying about we, right? And
Yes.
but before, one thing that a lot of people, I think, get wrong about this idea of activism and sort of trying to change the world is, before you can get there, you have to understand yourself and understand your flaws and your strengths. And you have to be able to fix your life before you can try to fix the world, right? So all of the people that Maslow was looking at had all of their flaws and stuff like that, but they had also really dug into themselves, right? You have to be very aware of who you are before you can start trying to change humanity for better. Because if you don't understand yourself, how can you understand somebody else? How can you change the world? So like, and a lot of people are going to give me crap for quoting Jordan Peterson, but if you can't clean up your room, how are you going to fix the world? Right? Like that's a very basic concept that I think we try to skip steps. You try to skip steps. You have to work on yourself before you can work on your neighborhood, and you have to work on your neighborhood before you can work on your city, on your state, your country, and then the world, right? Everybody wants to start at this massive, I need to fix the world. If everybody just did X, it would all be perfect. It's like, okay, well, they're not gonna. So try to fix what you can fix, which comes from stoicism for me. Fix
Yeah.
what you can fix.
Yeah.
And that sphere of influence will grow, right? So take care of yourself and then take care of the world, and understand that it's all connected and it's all the same. It's all really the same thing when it comes down to it. And that's, to me, what transcendence really is. And that the self-actualization piece is the cleaning your room part first, right? You have to self-actualize and do the work on yourself before you can transcend that and try to fix the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, super does.
Do
In
you
terms of,
do you disagree with anything?
um, I don't actually. I think that's actually, I'm really glad you brought up trans species.
Mm-hmm.
It made me think of, the Buddhist philosophy that I'm kind of refer back to, in the sense that the Buddhist metaphysic is that everything is interdependently arising and
Yes.
impermanent. And we get into psychological problems by attaching ourselves to permanent forms
Mm-hmm.
that, by their very nature, aren't going to be that way. And this
Yep.
includes mental states as well. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
feeling anxiety is arising, and the impermanent process I call Sean
Yep.
is a way better thing to say to myself than,
Mm-hmm.
fuck, I'm anxious.
Yep.
Because the latter identifies an I as
Mm-hmm.
solid, permanent,
Mm-hmm.
anxiety as a solid, permanent state. And now
Mm-hmm.
I am an anxious person,
Mm-hmm.
versus this impermanent chemical, emotional, social process. Because I'm also living in these structures that are potentially unhealthy, living in an information diet that we frankly have no idea what the long term consequences are. And based on all of that, or to put it another way, here's an interesting one. One of my buddies said, "Man, I just got back from the doctor, and it turns out my thyroid isn't working very well. And I've thought something's been wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
The last 2 years, I've been short tempered,
Mm-hmm.
depressed, just not in a good way. And I've
Yep.
like been pretty hard on myself."
Mm-hmm.
And the doctor was like, "You should take this medication." And
Mm-hmm.
I've been taking it, and those things have gone away. Turns out it
Yep.
wasn't me, it was my thyroid. And I'm like,
Yep.
well, that's freaking profound.
Yep.
And how often do we, turns out it wasn't me, it was all these other things. So
Mm-hmm.
I really like that. I really like the idea that, these kind of self actualized people are often the ones that give of themselves in a certain
Mm-hmm.
kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
that do transcend the limitations of a limited self, that
Mm-hmm.
identify as stardust. And then as soon as you say that, I'm like you, what is that? It's mind blowing is an interesting turn of phrase, because
Mm-hmm.
it breaks apart
Mm-hmm.
any kind of front, back, up, down,
Well, that's what an
before,
existential
after.
crisis is. Yeah.
In a
Yeah.
way, I think, and it's linked to, interesting, to kind of link this back to the wisdom workshop. I think, I did a piece on, that I haven't published yet, on and still working on existential emergence versus existential crises. And emergence, when there's too much emergence at once from the way things were, it becomes an emergency. So we have like, oh shit, there's emergency now, which is just a bunch of emergence happening at once. And so when I have a crisis, my little mini existential crisis of working really hard to make a living as an independent musician and realizing maybe I don't want to make money with music. Actually, maybe that's a foolish goal, which prompted a crisis because I had just spent a lot of time and energy doing said thing and money.
Yeah.
Versus that crisis led to, how else am I going to serve? How else am I going to grow? Interestingly, to the last point I'll say, who am I and what do I have to offer? To be able to be confident in saying, I love to learn.
Yep.
And that's, people learn by watching other people. People love to learn by watching other people who love to learn. I see you're fucking enjoying the process of learning. That makes me want to go learn.
Yeah.
That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
I enjoy conversating, so I'm going to go have conversatings. And I'm not going to care whether or not I say that word right. Yeah. That's not the point. So in that regard, me understanding who I am, why I'm here, which is still, I kind of bristle at that because it's not just one thing. But understanding who I am directly relates to my ability to move beyond who I am, which is interesting, you know, some of the advice from a lot of different spiritual traditions is just to get out of a funk, figure out ways to serve. What can you do to help other people? You realize that there's a lot of people with a lot of things, and not just people. I am glad that you said that. That's the only other thing I really agreed with, is as we move forward, I think in our age of increased chemical pollution that we're not talking about, and increased ecological consequences, that, you know, this kind of understanding of all our relations in a Plains Native American sense, I think it's really helpful. We're also interrelated with time, and I know you both have work obligations to get to today.
Yeah.
So I want to respect that and put some boundaries on this so that we can transcend it.
Yeah.
Any final words? All right. Maybe a place to go next time if we go somewhere next time.
To me, one of just sort of my parting thought is, you know, we talked about mastery, we talked about the workshop, and again, the self-actualization piece is about being the best you that you are, the self-actualization.
Yeah.
But again, we started this conversation talking about self-actualization leading into the transcendence, right? And so those aren't separate things. Those are the chain and the dynamic interplay of them, right? And so if you examine your life and you figure out, like you've done, what makes me feel the most fulfilled, it's probably for you, one of the most fulfilling things is teaching or watching people, maybe not even just teaching, like seeing the moment of recognition where somebody is like, oh yes. For me, it's that, which is why I love jujitsu and kind of teaching jujitsu and coaching in general, but also service, right? So like right now I'm doing, I do, it's called CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocacy. So I kind of like walk a kid going through a neglect and dependency case, whether there was abuse or drugs or alcohol, whatever it is, and kind of walking them through the 18-month plus or minus kind of court process, right? Well, that's some rough stuff, right? So like you're dealing with very unhappy situations, very bad situations, and you'd think that would like be super depressing, right? But like being able to provide that sort of service to somebody who doesn't have the ability um, to take care of themselves or advocate for themselves, like that, I knowing that I'm doing something for somebody else, it sounds selfish, but it's kind of one of the keys for me being happy in general is the more that I do for other people, the better I feel myself and the more transcendent I feel and the more self-actualized I am, right? Because it's not just about you, it's not just about me. That service aspect, um, I think is important, but not to rush it. Like I wasn't a CASA when I was 20 because I didn't know who I was. I would have made a bigger disaster of all of these situations as a 20-year-old Jimmy than good I would do, right? Like imagine 20-year-old Jimmy. You met 24-year-old Jimmy. That was bad enough, right? That was after I'd already had an existential crisis to come back down to earth, right? So when you're at the right point, starting to think about those types of things, I think is really important for that self-actualization piece.
Yeah, I'm really glad. That's a great place to end. And another way of saying, I put a quote in here: "The more I do for other people, the better I feel myself."
Mm-hmm.
The I lead people in the wisdom workshop on writing the good life. The first big inquiry is, what is the good life?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we really get to is it's different for different people,
Mm-hmm.
but a thread that comes out is the good life is helping other people live a good life.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel for, I don't think our culture and society is set up for very many opportunities for that. So I
Mm-hmm.
applaud you for finding court appointed special advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be cool to do what opportunities are there for people to help other people?
Well, there's a ton. There really are. There are a lot. I've looked into it a lot, and so
That would be a
I,
cool, that'd be
I
a
know a
cool
lot
thing
about
to,
it. That.
that'd be a cool thing to put together, I think, for younger
Yeah.
people that are looking for opportunities to help, because
Mm-hmm.
it feels so good.
Oh
And
yeah.
maybe it's just not on, we can do a series of TikToks on that.
Yep.
All right. Jimmy, that's always fun. I
Yep.
appreciate you taking the time. I'll put some of these notes in here and appreciate your help and agency
Yeah.
choosing to spend it here. And
Mm-hmm.
thanks everyone who's still listening to this. Got something out of it. Let me know, let us know, and maybe we'll see you in an upcoming wisdom workshop.
All right. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Jimmy.